today is that the reason the entourage effects matter for cannabis vapor regulations is that terpenes, many of those same terpenes that are found in cannabis, are also regulated as food flavor additives, and that these recent flavor bans may have the unintended effect of banning terpenes and the entourage or ensemble effects from standardized vapor products now and in the future. And that's really the answer, and I hope to get to through this presentation, but just to kind of get us started with that answer up front. I think that's the danger that we face, that if we don't address safety and safety of vapor products, that we could end up losing the entourage effect in the process. So Dr. Richard Hall was a co-founder of the Flavor and Extract Manufacturers Association's expert panel. He was also a chemist, and what he did, he was a brilliant man, recently deceased. What he did is recognize that on the heels of the Food Additives Amendment in 1958, that non-governmental entities had a role to play in establishing safety, particularly for flavor ingredients in the food industry. So within FEMA, he started an expert panel and established the scientific methodology to look at the safety of flavor additives. And I like this quote that he would often speak to, which, if you spend enough time in our industry, he's referring to the food flavor industry, the lawyers start sounding like scientists and the scientists start sounding like lawyers. And I think that could certainly apply to cannabis and all its flavors at this point. So I share this quote now for two reasons. One, to give a little bit of foreshadowing of what this talk is about. Less chemistry, more policy and regulation, but also to plug chemistry. It kind of speaks to how important chemistry and the language of chemistry is in getting technical policy. And if you're a chemist, you've probably heard the saying that chemistry is the central science. And I think that's very true. I found that in my professional career, and speaking to policy and helping regulators figuring out technical regulations or statutes, that chemistry and science is a different language. And that being a chemist or a scientist, you have to be careful with what you think your words mean, because often the layman doesn't necessarily take them to mean the thing you think. So since I provide that lead in of giving a similar talk back at the ACS meeting in Orlando with CANN, which is about 8 months ago, I figured we'd walk a little bit down memory lane to give a little bit of context of where we are currently with vapor products and how vape has gone from being the Oxford Word of the Year in 2014 to this point in time where vape is a dirty, almost scared word at this point. So back in the beginning of 2018, you started to see news stories such as this. There was concern about toxic additives, particularly in nicotine e-cigarettes, but there wasn't too much concern. There wasn't many people that were paying attention. Most people assumed that, okay, we've been using flavor additives in nicotine e-cigarettes now for 10 years. The cannabis industry has also been using various flavor additives and terpenes in vape products, and nobody was too concerned. Nobody was expecting any sort of acute condition, but there were a few people paying attention. Some of the cannabis regulators out there started asking a few questions and quickly realized that this is a very complex area that they didn't necessarily have the technical expertise to address. Fast forward that about a year and a half, and you had the first news coverage of what was then being called vapey, and it was a vape illness linked to vapor products. Then in the middle of August, the Centers for Disease Control got involved and identified it as a serious concern. The number of reported cases were piling up, so the CDC said, okay, we need to get involved and see if we can figure out what is going on. Then the third week of August, we had the first reported death caused from the vaping illness. Then towards the end of August, I'm sure you probably all remember, we have the first assessments of what else could be going on here. So David Downs in particular from Leafly I believe he was the first to start asking the question, what has changed? What's different now than what has happened in the recent past? And one of the things he brought up and started a conversation about tocopherol acetate and potential lipid pneumonia. Shortly thereafter, although there wasn't any solid evidence that flavor additives or, and especially terpenes were causing this vape illness, you had states begin to enact flavored vape bans, or in some cases, bans on all vapor products. So Washington State's my home state. That was quickly followed by a temporary flavored vape product ban in Oregon. And then almost about the same time, you saw others challenging some of these bans. So Michigan was one of the first to have an e-cigarette and vapor ban. That was blocked. Massachusetts was challenged but was allowed to stand. And you've also had other challenges and successful injunctions by particularly the nicotine vapor industry and in Oregon and now in Washington. So you see a lot of confusion going on about why these vape bans are in place, why flavors are being targeted, and it's a big mishmash of conflated issues. Just that nicotine vapor products are being conflated with cannabis vapor products, and then illicit products versus regulated products. There still remains a lot of confusion on the policy and regulatory side. So on the science side, it's worth asking, are we any closer to understanding what EVALI is? And the answer is we are not. So we have some theories. Tocopherol acetate and lipid pneumonia was one of the first. Cadmium and silver solder and cadmium pneumonitis. Also a theory. Other possibilities that pesticide contamination, perhaps added by flavor compounds and combination of factors are likely at play here. So I just wanted to run through that as historical and scientific context. What I was hoping we could focus on today is what happens when the dust clears. What happens when we figure out, one, maybe what is causing this acute set of conditions, and the work that needs to be done downstream to demonstrate the safety of vapor products, particularly cannabis vapor products, with flavor and terpene additives. Now, I do like to show this graph at this point, because there's continued to have vape bans enacted, flavor bans being put in place. The CDC's data is clearly starting to show a trend towards a decline in incidences. So you can see over there on the right, there's a caveat that there's a reporting lag, but each week CDC continues to update this graph, and you continue to see, even with the reporting lag, that it looks like the number of cases is declining. So, whatever has happened in the last 3 months, there seems to be removing the problem that's causing or was the trigger for that acute illness. So, assuming at some point, or assuming that trend continues, and even if we start to understand what was the triggers of EVALI, we're going to have some work to do as an industry. They're going to have to be able to demonstrate the safety of additives that we're using, including flavors, if we expect to move forward and expect to have these products not be banned or just prohibited overall into the future. So this is what I consider the playbook or the key points in doing that. I think it's important that we do start to set up a system where we can evaluate additives for inhalation safety. So the lead into this talk, the teaser for this talk was how we could use the Food or the Flavor Extract Manufacturers Association's GRAS expert panel as a model. And I think that is a very strong model that we can use and adapt to cannabis and safety of additives via inhalation. I think it's clear at this point that cannabis vapor products need to be treated separately from nicotine or tobacco vapor products. There's a lot of differences there. Probably have to speak to that to the audience here. It's very clear that beyond being plants, there are vast differences between these two different plants and their products. And in practical terms, I believe we need to start with some basic or draft prohibited and permitted list of ingredients. and at least to provide a starting point, and at least to create a framework for moving forward, because regulators and legislators, they need assistance now. So the question that's often asked when we start talking about inhalation safety is, what flavor regulations for inhaled use can we use that are already existing? So there are some pieces that can be used, but not as much as you might think. People are often surprised to learn that there is no flavor additive safety regulations or very little data when it comes to tobacco products. There's a famous list of 599 additives that are used in cigarettes, but in terms of testing those for safety or risk, there's at least little public data. Even the nicotine vape world, they're just starting to evaluate flavor safety. So there's not yet any permitted lists. There's preliminary prohibited lists. And there's these other areas you might think would be able to add some safety data to different flavor additives. There's little or nothing that's applicable. So the key here is that there's limited safety data on low dose intermittent use. We have some data through NIOSH, through workplace safety, that is exposing, or we have understanding of what happens if somebody's exposed to, say, a high concentration of limonene over 8 hours and what that means. But in terms of how somebody is being exposed using a vape pen, there's very little data to go on. So we can look to Europe to provide a starting point and evaluating additive safety. The Tobacco Products Directive helped define what is required for nicotine vapor products in Europe, and some of their standards include establishing purity for different substances and prohibiting things I think most people would agree don't belong in cannabis vapor products or nicotine vapor products. Things like vitamins, which may convince a consumer that the product is healthier than it is. Other psychoactive or physiological active substances like caffeine and taurine, they might not expect in cannabis. And things that are definitely harmful, carcinogenic, mutagenic, or reproductive toxins. The British Standards Institute is a bit of an equivalent to a USP here in the US. They have provided some of their thoughts for what should be tested in nicotine vapor products in Europe. They have called for emissions testing, so testing the aerosol stream for metals, degradants, things like acrolein. And one interesting recommendation they had made is that in terms of practical risk management, that only artificial flavors should be considered. Now, they made that recommendation with the understanding that artificial flavors are more of a known quantity. You understand their composition a bit better than natural flavors. And I call that out because in the US, as we step through flavored bans and how regulators are trying to address them, there's definitely been more of an interest in allowing natural flavors rather than artificial flavors. And some of that comes from what is derived from the cannabis plant, but some is also a bit of a misunderstanding of the natural being equivalent to safe. So just something for us to keep in mind when we have these conversations in state houses with regulators now regularly. But as all of you out there, if you're having these conversations, something to keep in mind. Where are we going? Who else has looked at this issue, and who else can we pull into helping address this problem in the present? So cannabis and tobacco are clearly different. How are they different? Ensemble effects is something that I think is a clear distinction between cannabis and cannabis vapor products and tobacco and nicotine vapor products. Nobody really claims that there's other compounds in tobacco that are beneficial or a critical part of the tobacco effect. Terpene classified as flavor additives, I mentioned that at the outset. It's a very clear issue here in that although terpenes may be serving other functions, that they are generally regulated as flavor additives. So they are now being part and parcel of flavor bans for vapor products across the country here. Other differences between nicotine and cannabis products, you have different hazard velocities, different diluents and carriers that are being used, even different devices and characteristics of those devices. So the good news is that this is not an unprecedented situation. As the teaser for this talk mentioned, we have been in this situation before. In terms of food, only about 60 years ago, we had food technologists and food manufacturers start to add different flavor compounds, other additives to food, and Congress and the FDA realized, wow, what's going on? We have all these new things being added to food. We don't really understand what it is. And you started to have some public outcry from, just being concerned with what's going on in our food. Is it safe? So in 1958, the Food Additives Amendment was passed, and that required FDA to look at all the components that were being placed in the food and evaluate them for safety. Now, at the time, that was looked at as a gargantuan task. Maybe some thought was intractable. But fortunately, you had industry associations and others outside of the government start to think critically and creatively about this. And one of those was Dr. Richard Hall, in collaboration with FEMA, Flavor Extract Manufacturers Association. They realized that they could take some of the weight off of FDA's shoulders and address flavor compound safety in food and move that forward. And they realized that if they did not, then there was a risk that flavor compounds or other additives could indeed be prohibited from food. So the FEMA model, particularly the expert panel of FEMA, is a good model to emulate, as is the International Fragrance Association and the RFIM. It's their own expert panel that did this for fragrances. So where do we start? So for cannabis, and again, taking a page out of both FDA's book and FEMA's book, we're going to start with an inventory of volatile compounds in cannabis. And this would be akin to the inventory that FDA gathered together for food in the 1950s. Again, they didn't know what was being added to food, so their first step was to find out what was indeed being added to food products and start there. So with cannabis, fortunately, we have a fair amount of literature now demonstrating or citing the different compounds, particularly terpenes, that are found in cannabis. So that's a good place for us to start. What is actually in cannabis? And if it's in cannabis, does it mean that the relative risk is similar if using those same compounds for cannabis vapor products? And we also start with the permitted additive list. Again, this is something similar to what the FDA and FEMA did back in the 50s. And that's to say, okay, if something was already naturally occurring in food, if something was already in food, then it's a safe place to start. We're going to grandfather that list in to a certain extent, and we're going to move forward and then come back and assess that, just to provide a starting point, because some of this stuff takes a long time. So FEMA, for example, has been doing their work for 60 years with their expert panel, and they still continue to look at the safety of different flavor ingredients. What I think we also need to help assuage some of the fears of regulators and legislators at this point around the nation is a draft prohibited list. And as I showed for some of the earlier slides, there are some things that we can work off of. The Tobacco Product Directive has started to think about this. British Standards Institute. There are these disparate lists that clearly identify some compounds that are of concern that we can start with, and for providing some guidance on what should not be included in vapor products. So here I list a number of different terpenes that are found in cannabis. All those listed here have been cited by at least 5 references in the literature. And those of you that are chemists would clearly understand the CAS numbers that are here in brackets. I put these on this slide to make a point that in speaking with regulators and legislators, it's important that we clearly define what we're talking about. It's important that we help them see the value of specifying chemistry clearly, that we don't just rely on labels. Because a chemist will hear limonene and say, okay, which one? Where a layman might hear limonene and say, okay, that's just one thing. So it's important that we have chemical specificity in what we're talking about and in devising policy. So here's a few other potentially concerning inhaled flavor additives. These highlighted in yellow are tested for in Europe in the aerosol stream of nicotine vapor products. They may be some of the first compounds that you would put on a prohibited list. This is a proposed list by FDA. I think the public comment period has just closed, where they proposed adding additional compounds to the harmful and potentially harmful constituents in tobacco products list. You'll notice the ones in yellow you saw on the previous slide. These are tested for in Europe and aerosol streams. And those here in pink are relatively common diluents used in nicotine vapor products. Not so much in cannabis vapor products, but important to note that these things are not necessarily completely safe, but in the context of other diluents or lesser known entities, maybe not as risky as some of those alternatives. So how do we begin to assess safety? How do we do this practically moving forward as a cannabis vapor industry? I think we start with the targeted industry association. I think there's a lot of good work that's being done out there with your general cannabis industry associations, but for the most part, those groups have one or two individuals that may be well versed in this complex topic, and they're trying to pull disparate resources together, come up with practical resources and guidance. And they are doing important work. I think there's a lot of value in pulling all that expertise together. An industry association can focus on this particular issue so it can be addressed with a clear voice and very well thought out ideas. So establishing an independent expert panel, again, that's right out of the FEMA playbook, and creating resources for legislators and regulators. That's something that FEMA has done. That's something that there is a clear demand for across the nation at this point. There's a dearth of knowledge and understanding. There's a lot of people just asking for, give us something that we can hang our hat on, give us something that makes sense now that we won't regret later. So some of the characteristics you'd want in a targeted industry association, again, I think it's important that you would focus on cannabis vapor products. And this particular industry association could then act as a resource for all of our other general cannabis industry associations and work hand in glove in that way. You would also need an industry association that values scientific rigor and transparency. If this industry association was going to be responsible for promulgating safety data, you had to be clear that there's no conflict of interest here, that that data is unimpeachable and serves the public health. Now, some other characteristics that you might like to see, again, this is right out of the FEMA playbook, but again, a lot that applies to what I believe needs to be done here with cannabis. So in terms of establishing an independent expert panel, you establish that industry associations focus on, again, like FEMA. You can then establish an expert panel where you can bring together experts in these disparate fields to weigh in on inhalation safety for vapor products. So some of the bullet points listed here are the requirements for the GRAS paradigm as listed in the Food Additives Amendment. So you need general recognition of safety by experts. That's one of the criteria that's required for GRAS, or generally recognized as safe. You need to have expert panels that are qualified by training and experience to be those experts. You need to base your determinations on safety and scientific procedures. And you need to take into account the intended use. So early on in looking at flavor additives for vapor products, a lot was made about the FEMA GRAS list. Okay, these compounds are FEMA GRAS, so they should be safe for vapor products. You know, FEMA was very vocal about saying, no, that's not the case. We did our safety determinations based on intended use of ingestion. Inhalation is a different story, so you can't automatically assume that FEMA GRAS means GRAS for inhalation. So it's clear that if we were going to be doing this, creating a similar expert panel or had a GRAS for inhalation use, then it needs to be assessing those things that are specific to inhalation. Some of the specific criteria for FEMA grass that the FEMA expert panel uses to evaluate the safety of different compounds. Natural exposure to substances in specific foods. And here I put foods in brackets because you could replace that with cannabis. In this case, natural occurrence in cannabis, the chemical identity and specific chemical structure of the compound being addressed and assessed, the metabolic and pharmacokinetic characteristics of that compound, and you're looking at other data outside of humans, animal toxicity data. I reference here the article that was shared as part of the promotion of this talk. And if you'd like to learn more about the FEMA GRASS program, both the scientific and policy underpinnings of it, I certainly encourage you to read this article. Another important function of this focused industry association on cannabis vapor products is providing different resources. So again, we mentioned permitted and prohibited lists. You can explain the criteria for establishing those lists. You can provide regulatory resources, helping states understand what other states have done, trying to figure out the right answers to some of these questions. You can create simple things like FAQs at this point. What's the best messages that should be shared with consumers? How do you best address uncertainty? Now, all these sorts of things can be targeted by this sort of focused industry association. They can balance the need for information and particularly harm minimization strategies now with safety evaluation and harm minimization strategies in the future. So why do we need to act now? Again, I think one of the key things, and this is a differentiator from nicotine or tobacco vapor products, we'd like to preserve the standardized ensemble effect formulations. I don't think many would like to see terpenes permanently prohibited from vapor products. A lot of terpenes are used to make vapor products and extract products more like the cannabis they come from. Nobody else is doing it. At this point, there's a vacuum when it comes to data, and there's nobody really that is in a position yet to start doing this, to do it in a cohesive form and to have people band together and start putting out good information. We need this to be addressed specifically. And if we could pull together an expert panel that's specific to cannabis vapor products, then we could move into a regime where we're actually testing these ingredients for safety via inhalation. So circle back to the call to action. I think it's very clear at this point as more states contemplate vape bans. Even you saw yesterday a bill introduced to Congress about prohibiting all e-cigarette vapor products. At this point, we need to evaluate flavor additives for safety. We can't stick our heads in the sand, or this could be a prohibition. We could see all vape products or at least flavored vape products prohibited in the future. Again, we need to make it clear that nicotine, tobacco vape products are different than cannabis vape products, and we need a starting point. So, to circle back, why the entourage effects matter for cannabis vape regulations, I think it may be clear now. I think it's important that we meet this head on. We begin to assess safety of these ingredients, and we maybe take a different tact than the tobacco or nicotine industry has done in terms of evaluating risk and safety of additives. And that's the challenge before us. If this is something that you are interested in, I certainly welcome you to contact me afterwards. And I'm very open at this point to any questions or comments from all of you out there.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Douglas, for this great presentation. We will, I have a bunch of questions here from attendees. So, you mentioned pesticides, and we have an attendee who's asking if there's any details available regarding specific pesticides, but maybe this feeds back into your talking point of there not being that type of data available yet.
Yeah, I would say the one that you see in the news the most is myclobutanol, but that is more, a concern of what it could degrade into with heat. I don't believe, at least that I'm aware of, that there's any clear data of specific pesticide residues causing a problem in terms of E-Valley. But you could certainly understand, depending on the exposure, how different pesticides could lead to an underlying inflammatory effect in the lungs. But no, specifically, I don't think any particular pesticides have been called out or identified as being a cause or a trigger of E-Valley.
Uh, Would you say it's fair that pesticide levels are a factor um, in this, or would you say they're not really a factor?
I don't think the data is there to say definitively that they are, but I think there's a good chance that they are part of this multifactorial occurrence. They might not have been that trigger, that ultimate trigger that led to this acute illness or condition, but it's likely that there's some effect there.
Okay. We have perhaps a silly question from Nacho Business. This attendee says, "I smoke $10 vape carts all summer. How long do I have to live, doc?" I would say 0 to 70 years, but that's just me. How would you respond to someone who says, I use these cheap vapes all summer? You know, should they stop it? Should they simply just read the labels more, be more fastidious in how they choose their products?
Yeah, I like that answer. I think I'd go with 0 to 70 years likely lifespan. But I think it is, there is an instructive guidance here that you should know your source. You should know what's in your product, whether it's a vape product or anything else. And, it's very clear that you have more data available if you're purchasing products out of the regulated market. So you
Okay.
have testing data, you have potency data, you have, in some cases, metal data, pesticide data. That would be my advice, that, if you continue to consume vapor products, you should use those and purchase those from the regulated marketplace and know what's in them.
Okay. And a follow-up to that, Julie Fry, one of our attendees, is asking, could the decline be because dank vape, or I assume also related products, are being prevented from further sales, or at least being inhibited? Do you think that's part of the reason we're seeing the decline?
That's a strong theory. So that was the advent of dank vapes, and particularly the use of copperyl acetate in some of those dank vape products could very well have been that ultimate trigger. So I think that's a lead theory. I don't think it's settled at this point, but that very well could be.
All right. It's a competitive theory. It's
Competitive theory.
perfect. Regarding the actual hardware, the devices that pods or oils or whatever go into, should these inhalation devices be regulated like medical devices, like they are in Europe, like in Germany, or be required to meet similar standards as medical inhalation devices? Is that over the top, or do you think that's an appropriate direction to move in?
Well, yeah, it's good to start with what we know currently and some of the existing regulatory structures. The FDA, for example, treats an e-cigarette as both the composition, the e-juice that's inside, and the device as a combination product.
Hmm. Okay.
They take that seriously. They say you can't necessarily look at the device in isolation from the substance that's inside of it. The challenge, I'd say, for cannabis regulations is that those products aren't necessarily sold together or even designed together. So there's a real challenge to assess that combined safety or risk in the cannabis marketplace, just by the way that it's those products have been developed and distributed.
Interesting. And this is a little bit outside the focus of your discussion, but a lot of these inexpensive devices and products that are filled with oil, as you say, they're not designed together. A lot of people point to China, and over the last 9 months, there's been a trade war in China. Do you think those types of international things may also have played a role in the vape crisis, or is that just a crazy economic theory?
I certainly think there's, some possible validity there. I'd mentioned cadmium contamination used in cheap silver solder. There's by Green Grow Labs in Colorado, they showed some very clear similarities between, metal fume fever and this E Valley. So it could have been that was, also a strong competitive theory about what is one of the triggers or the trigger of E Valley. So very well could have been one benefit of this trade war.
uh, Knowledge is power once you can act on it. So yeah, I would tend to agree. Daniel Hughes asks a good question, and I don't know if there's data here or not, but are there any concerns about mineral oil in vapor products or in cannabis, vapor products?
I'd heard that theory early on, and I think it was mostly baseless. I don't believe, or I hadn't seen anybody validate that anybody was actually using mineral oil. Again, there's some theories, or people thought that different individuals or groups might have been using mineral oil, but I have never seen a validated use or that mineral oil is actually used in any cases. So I wouldn't think that one holds much water.
Okay. Um, an anonymous attendee is asking, in your opinion, is it likely that we'll not see this type of standardization or efforts to create standards for these products without federal legalization? There's a lot of talk about industry and even elected officials calling for federal regulation of cannabis products. Is this vape crisis is an opportunity to legalize, federally regulate cannabis and prevent such further instances? Do you think that federal legalization is preventing the type of standardization you're proposing?
I would certainly say it would be easier to address with federal legalization. The federal government, CDC, FDA, they have more of the resources and expertise to address this complex area, and that federal legalization would certainly stimulate addressing some of these things. Now, I think it's incumbent upon us as the industry to be hopeful that we're moving towards that sort of situation and to start planning for its occurrence. So some of these things that I mentioned here today, establishing an industry association, starting to bring together the expertise to evaluate safety, can be done in the lead up to that, and to even prep and make it easier for our regulators in DC to address once that time comes.
Okay, so we don't have to wait for the current president to try and legalize it in a desperate attempt to get reelected. We should start acting on it now.
I would agree, yes.
And in line kind of with that, another question from Julie Fry is regarding MCT oil and it being used as a diluent in vape products. And I have heard it on both sides of the fence. One, I've heard, MCT oil, or read, is used to intubate infants in the ER. On the other hand, people say you shouldn't use MCT oil. I'm assuming there's a nuance there or caveat used regarding MCT oil because, again, it's getting heated really hot. But what are your thoughts on MCT oil in cannabis vaping devices?
Well, the truth is we don't yet know. We have states like Colorado who have added MCT to their list of prohibited substances. The theory goes too that MCT being a fat, even though it's a medium chain triglyceride, could cause lipid pneumonia. I caution that simplistic evaluation of it, because I also look to cannabinoids themselves as being lipid-like and also of higher molecular weight. I think we're dealing with something here that's more compound specific than just a broad class of lipid pneumonia. So I'm going to punt on that one. I think that their MCTs could potentially be harmful, especially in large enough doses. but I think it's unclear at this point whether they are in fact, whether MCT is in fact dangerous or not.
Yeah, and that is a good point. I would personally agree with that too. And I was kind of shocked to read about all the things that might cause lipid pneumonia, things like chapstick and overuse of it, which has things like MCT oil sometimes and other things. Uh, but Montana has reversed the flavor ban on products. A judge reversed it and said it's an issue with the illicit market, and we shouldn't punish businesses that are following regulations, sometimes painfully following regulations. Do you think Montana made the right decision here, or do you think more states might follow suit, or is this just sort of a one-off thing that's happening in Montana? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think if we look at the data, the chances that a lot of the issues are being caused by black market products are strong. I do think that Montana taking this tack and I guess planting their flag in the soil that the illicit market is most likely the real danger in this proximal case, and maybe the long-term danger is a good balance for us as a society, because that is one of the dangers we face. If we place an overabundance of caution on the regulated marketplace, then we could potentially lose that regulated marketplace. We could favor the illicit marketplace. You ban flavored products from regulated outlets. People want those anyway, so they go down the street to their illicit marketplace and purchase them that way. So yeah, in my opinion, at this point in time, based on what we know, it's a better approach to talk about the benefits of the regulated marketplace and to caution people the most about the illicit marketplace.
Oh, excellent. I was just at a conference today, and I'm sure people have been seeing elsewhere that a lot of companies are dropping all their vapor products, whether it's a flower pod or flower thing. I've seen things for the volcano vaporizers that are pre-packed cannabis flowers. So, I guess the question is it a business mistake to either just to throw, the cannabis vaping out with the vaping illness bathwater, or, is that a smart business decision? Is vaping and inhalation of cannabis products going away? Because that's an issue with, feeding the illicit market as well. So should businesses stick to their guns and maybe just go the flower vaping route, or should they plan on releasing products in the future? It seems like a lot of businesses are just canceling those lines of products. Do you have some thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. I think one of the challenges businesses face, particularly with vapor products, is that they're not making decisions in isolation. They have insurance underwriters who are paying attention to news stories, and the insurance industry, especially when it comes to cannabis, is particularly conservative. So you're starting to see underwriters change their policies, either raise rates or have different exclusions. So some of these decisions are being made strictly on a business decision. Okay, our insurance rates have gone up. Our insurer says we can't use X, Y, and Z. So, for the time being, we're going to get out of it.
Okay.
Again, I think looking at this globally, that is a disservice to the marketplace when regulated companies are ending their product lines. Because I don't believe that just by limiting or eliminating the availability of these products that you limit demand. So, I understand businesses taking that tack. I just think that as a society, as legislators, regulators, we need to get ahead of this so we don't discourage, continued understanding of these products and making these products as safe as possible.
Okay, good. So taking what you've presented today, what would need to be done, or questions that would need to be answered for lipids to be considered an appropriate route of administration for cannabinoids? Because you mentioned there's certain information we're missing. just sort of applying what you've shared with us today. Let's take, maybe MCT or other short chain lipids. What would be steps to like what data, what sort of questions would need to be answered to be able to say, yes, this is appropriate for route of administration for the medicinal use of cannabinoids?
So let me answer that from the perspective of toxicologist. I'm not a toxicologist. I just know enough to be dangerous. But I asked a similar question to toxicologists, and it's their opinion that the safety data that's been used for ingestion is maybe 70% relevant to inhalation, that there's some crossover. So that means there's another 30% that you have to establish the methods and models to evaluate, the risk and toxicology. That is part of the challenge. That is one of the things that would have to be developed by, the expert panel, different scientists that would be looking at this, because there is still a dearth of understanding about what's important for lung health, what can change that very delicate balance in your lungs, and how everything fits together. I think that's one of the challenges before us, is understanding what models can be used and developed to evaluate just that. Is MCT safe? I can't say that we have the models at this point to answer that definitively.
That's a good question. It seems like it would behoove companies to hire toxicologists.
I would agree with that. Toxicologists unite.
There you go. One or two questions left for you. Are you aware of any reports regarding the phthalate content from dank vape carts or other carts on the market?
I am not.
All right. I guess one more peak to add to your chromatogram. This might be kind of the last question. This is more of a proposal. It'd be, maybe you can comment on the feasibility of this, but if an industry group got together and wanted to study vape cartridges that were on the market, months before and months during and after the vape crisis, how is there a way for people to get a hold of carts that have been on the market? I know the workshop does a lot of testing, but those are mostly regulated products. But do you think, I guess the question would be like, do you think a good initiative would be, let's look at the last year or two of vape carts and these products and see what potentially changed over time? Or do you think that maybe it's too nuanced and it's a combination of the device and the cartridge that you have to look at versus just what's in them?
I mean, I think what's in them is the lion's share of what's going on. I do think that the device plays a part, but I think you underline a very practical approach and looking at products that have a track record, that have been used, and understanding if they haven't changed, that maybe there's a fair understanding of the risk. And if new products have been introduced, what do they do differently that others haven't done before, to understand maybe what some of the potential issues or concerns in those new approaches are.
All right. I believe that wraps it up for the Q&A. Brad, is there anything you'd like to add to this? Where can people learn more? Are you doing a talk again? What anything you'd like to leave the attendees with?
Certainly. If this interests you, you have certainly an interest in the future of cannabis vape products, contact me. Get involved with your cannabis industry associations. Email me. Start thinking about this, talking to people about this, that there is a path forward. Research and better understand if safety is the answer. And we can do this, but it's going to take a village.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Douglas. This was a very timely and important talk for our members. I definitely learned some new things. It was a very clear message, and I loved your action items. Fantastic.
Well, thank you, Jehan. It's been great. Thank you, everyone.
All right. We'll see you all probably in about a month, unless our next speaker for the Journal Club goes on an early winter vacation. But So please keep an eye out for our next upcoming Journal Club announcement. And thank you all so much for attending today's Cannabis Chemistry Subdivision webinar about why the entourage effect matters for cannabis vapor regulations. And you can reach our presenter at brad@theworkshop.com. That's workshop, WERC. Thank you so much, and we'll be signing off shortly.